All right. Go. Okay, so we're going to continue with the animals chapter today and start talking about chordates, which will probably be a little more interesting for most of you because it's talking about things that are more similar to humans. And we're really going to talk about, first about all characteristics of all chordates, and then we're going to start talking about the different groups of chordates, which you probably know most of them, and talk about different adaptations that they have. They actually are classified very nicely by some of their adaptations to life outside of water, things like that. So we're going to talk about some of the characteristics that have evolved in different chordate animal groups. So a chordate is a animal that has basically a nerve cord on their back, a notochord on their back, at least at some point in their life. And we mostly equate them with the vertebrates, organisms that have a vertebral column, but there are some chordates that have like a spinal cord, have notochord, but don't have vertebrata, don't have bones on them. So we'll talk about some of those first. So all chordates have four characters. They have a dorsal hollow nerve cord, they have a notochord, they have a tail, and they have pharyngeal slits or clefts. Don't worry about the details of that. But this is at some point in their life. A lot of them lose these as they develop. A lot of them will, like we lose a tail. We don't have a tail when we're born, but we do have, during development, there is a tail-like structure that's part of us. Notochord is basically a flexible rod made of a bunch of cells that are pretty fibrous, and it kind of gives a structure to the back of the organism. The nerve cord carries nerve impulses up and down the back. So all chordates have those. So here's a chordate that does not have vertebrae, called a tunicate or a sea squirt. And you might find these if you go scuba diving. You may, when you first look at them, you might think it's a sponge. They look very similar. They actually behave a lot like sponges, but they are actually chordates. They actually do have a spinal cord at one point in their life. What these do is they have a larval stage. So just after birth, they have kind of a free-swimming larval stage, and this is where they have all those chordate features. They have that notochord, they have a tail, and they'll actually swim around for a little bit, and then they'll settle down, and their tail will become an attachment point for them, and they'll grow kind of attached to the substrate like that. So these guys themselves, the tunicates or sea squirts, actually partially made a lot of early scientists think that cephalopods, like squid, were similar to us, similar to other chordates, but they're actually very different because they kind of look like squid when they're free living, when they're this larval stage. As an adult, this is what a tunicate looks like. So this little kind of very kind of thick little thing that can be about that big. Some of them are smaller than that, and they look like a little sponge basically. And just like a sponge, they filter feed. They bring in water from the top of their body, and they squirt out the water from the side. This is where they get the name sea squirt, because they'll actually be squirting water as they filter feed. But it's kind of neat that these guys that look pretty much like a sponge are actually not all that distantly related to us and to other chordates like that. So that's a chordate without a vertebral column, but most chordates and most of the ones that we look at, that we'll look at through the rest of today, have a vertebral column. So they have some kind of protection for that spinal cord, for that nerve cord. And like us, we have bony vertebral column that protects our spinal cord, and it's flexible. Right. So So pretty important things that allow for a lot of the structures that chordates have. This vertebral column protects those nerve cells that are vitally important for movement and allows us then to be able to stand upright, and it kind of attaches into our skeletal column and really has a lot of key things to it. So some general vertebrate characteristics, and then we're going to go into these different groups of vertebrates and talk about how they're different. All vertebrates have some kind of closed circulatory system. So the animals that we looked at last class, we looked at sponges which have no circulatory system. They just, all their cells contact the water, and all their cells work fairly independently to gather nutrients. So they really have no circulatory system. We looked at arthropods, and arthropods really have what's called an open circulatory system. So they have structures that will pump like a heart and pump fluid like blood around their body, but it's not completely closed off. It actually pools in certain areas, and all it does is take nutrients and move them from one place to another, very much like what plants do. So plants have an open circulatory system. They take in water from their roots, pump it up through their leaves and out their leaves, and that's how they bring stuff up. Their phloem, again, is just open tubes that move things around. So a lot of animals of other groups besides chordates have those kind of open circulatory systems. Vertebrates have a closed circulatory system, so it'll be separate from everything else. So just like we do, we pump our blood in a complete circuit, and it never is open to the environment unless we get injured. Right? Most vertebrates also have a skeleton that's made of bone. There are some exceptions. There are organisms, which we'll look at in a bit, that have skeletons, but they're made of cartilage, and cartilage is softer than bone. It's a little bit different. Cartilage is flexible. So cartilage is what we find in our nose and our ears. That flexible yet sturdy and supportive material is cartilage, whereas most vertebrates have bone skeletons. So bone and teeth, which are fairly important in vertebrates for a lot of their functions, are initially were what was called unmineralized cartilage. So cartilage is flexible because it doesn't have the same mineral composition as bone does. Mineralization that has led to bone, and bones like our arms and legs and the rest of our skeleton, is thought to first come about as teeth, that organisms were feeding and they had cartilage-like skeletons, and they needed some way to be able to better feed, and having mineralization in their teeth. So instead of having soft teeth made of cartilage, having hard teeth made of bone would actually aid them in being better predators, being better able to feed. And we see that now today. So there are sharks which have cartilage-based skeletons, but they'll have mineralized teeth. So this is why you can often find a shark's tooth, but you're not going to find a shark's rib, at the bottom of the ocean, really, because the mineralized bone will actually survive after it's left the shark's body, but the cartilage will not. It'll break down pretty easily. So it was thought that mineralization started in the mouth, and there's condonts. There's a group called condonts that have mineralized teeth, and more recent lineages like mammals have further mineralized their skeleton, so that we have basically very little cartilage left in humans. Just our nose and our ears are really the only cartilage that are left in a human. But there are still things like sharks where the majority of their skeleton is cartilage. So there's really, at least from what I've read, maybe there's more recent work done, there's very little knowledge as to why the rest of the body mineralized. So teeth, you can kind of have an idea. It's going to be much easier to chew with hard teeth rather than soft teeth, but why the rest of the body? or what led to that, it's kind of not really known. So looking at sharks, sharks, rays, and these other aquatic organisms that have their skeleton made most of cartilage, they're called the chondrichthyans. There are a bunch of species, about 750 species. The largest of them are actually filter feeders. So there are sharks, basking sharks, whale sharks, that are actually filter feeders. So this one on the right here, which I think would be incredibly scary to come across, this shark with this giant open mouth, and these are called whale sharks. They're incredibly huge. They actually feed on plankton, so just stuff floating in the water. They are not predators, so they're pretty docile. They've actually been hunted nearly, or at least to being threatened, if not nearly extinct in some parts of the world, because they look so menacing. People used to just kill them and leave their bodies in the ocean. They wouldn't really do anything with them, or they would fin them to take their fins, but they really are harmful to people because they're filter feeders. The skeleton of most sharks, rays, and like ratfish and other chondrichthyans is mostly made of cartilage. There are some calcified parts to it, so their teeth are calcified. Also, their scales. Their scales, which is also calcified, which is kind of interesting. So this is one of the reasons why if you rub your hand on shark skin, it could be very painful, because if you go against it, it's this mineralized kind of structure. All right. So sharks, some kind of key features of sharks, they don't have a swim bladder. We're going to talk about what a swim bladder is later on when we look at the bony fish. But sharks, so a swim bladder, basically, for most fish, what they use it for is for buoyancy, is to allow them to kind of stay at one depth. So if any of you have been scuba diving, you wear something called a BCD, a buoyancy control device, that you fill with air. And that keeps you floating at a certain level. So you wear weights to keep you down, but then you wear a vest filled with air to keep you floating up. So you're not on the bottom of the ocean floor, you're also not at the surface, you can stay in the middle. And fish have these. They have these swim bladders that allow them to stay buoyant. Sharks don't have swim bladders. So this is where the myth that sharks have to stay swimming or else they'll die has come from, is that it's not that they will suffocate by any means. There are very, very rare few sharks that do not have muscles in their gills that are able to pump water across their gills. Most shark species can suck in water and pump it across their gills. So they'll be perfectly fine if they don't swim. But if they don't swim, because they have no swim bladder, they're going to sink down to the bottom of the ocean. So by moving, by constantly swimming, they're able to maintain their buoyancy, and they're constantly having to swim up, basically, and to stay buoyant. So it's not really true that sharks have to swim or else they'll die. It's that they have to swim or else they'll sink due to lack of swim bladder. They have very tough skins with highly derived scales. So here's a EM image of shark scales, and they do look like little teeth, and that's actually really what they are. They have calcium in them. They're basically teeth on the outside of their skin. The scales are really important for them. They help them to reduce water friction as they swim. And it's thought that teeth actually came about by modifying these scales. So that they actually thought that scales were the first thing that became calcified, and they were to allow for protection as well as for faster swimming. And then they started using modified scales to chew up their prey, and those are what became teeth. So it's kind of an interesting kind of quirk of evolution, is that scales came first and teeth came later. So those are your sharks. Most of the fish that you probably are familiar with are ray-finned or lobe-finned bony fish. They evolved about 400 million years ago in probably freshwater and then moved into saltwater. So we may or may not get into this in the ecology section, but this actually has a lot of consequences for them ecologically. So your sharks, which probably evolved in saltwater, are really well adapted to being in saltwater. Bony fish are actually, that evolved in freshwater, actually have to fight with the saltwater. So we talked a number of chapters ago about osmolarity and how if you put something in saltwater, it's going to lose water to the environment. Fish are constantly doing this, and they're constantly fighting against losing too much water. And they can drink, but they're drinking salt water. So they need to be able to drink the salt water and then excrete the salts. And that's one of the things they've had to adapt or come about with new ways of getting rid of salt from the water so they can better survive in salt water. And this is because they were originally they came about, they evolved in freshwater environments where they didn't have to do this, and then they returned to the saltwater to have to do that. The vast majority of fishes are egg-laying. There's well over 27,000 species of ray-finned fish. There's many other of similar kinds of fish. So the swim bladder, which I talked about in the shark, which is a pretty cool thing that these fish have, these bony fish have, that allows them to maintain buoyancy. The thought is that it actually evolved from a lung. So the current working theory is that fish that lived in kind of murky, swampy, freshwater environments where there's very little oxygen in the water because there's so much plant material, or there's so much bacteria and decomposing material and things like that that are chewing up all the oxygen that's in the water. These fish that lived in those environments, they were not able to get enough oxygen to thrive simply by filtering oxygen out of the water. And so at some point, some of them eventually evolved a mechanism for taking oxygen not only from the water, but also to be able to get oxygen from the air. And so there are a group called lungfish, and you may have heard of these before. Lungfish will swim up and they'll gulp air. And it actually, what's at least from what I've read, the initial kind of behavior of fish was to do that, was to swim up, take a gulp of air, and then they were able to absorb the oxygen from that air through part of their GI tract. And then over many generations and many years, some of them began to evolve separate structures that allowed them to gulp air and put it through a lung-like structure, or take in air or oxygen through water. So this was an evolution. This was a trait that had evolved in an environment where there was very little air in the water. So once these fish, these lungfish, some of them might have returned to an environment where there was plenty of oxygen in the water, they no longer needed to gulp air in order to survive, but gulping air allowed them to maintain buoyancy. So they're able to now, this was an X-adaptation, they were able to adapt those lungs for another use. And because they didn't necessarily need oxygen from the air, they could take some of the gases that are in their blood that they've removed from the water and put it into their lungs and use that as a swim bladder, so they wouldn't have to come up to the surface every time they needed to inflate that swim bladder. And so some of them, over time, lost the connection between their lungs and their mouth, and they now have what's called a swim bladder. So a lot of fish now have a swim bladder, which is thought to have evolved from a lung, and it contains gases that come out of the bloodstream into the swim bladder to make the fish more buoyant. And so now the fish doesn't have to constantly swim. So you might notice that if you see fish in a tank, they might just be hovering in one spot. And they can only do that because they have this swim bladder, which I think that's a really cool story. And how it comes about is kind of a neat idea, that it originally was these fish that needed extra oxygen, and then it changed to be used as a buoyancy control kind of thing. Okay, so that was one direction that these lungfish went in. So lungfish that returned to maybe a marine environment where there was more oxygen, that lung became a swim bladder. But other groups of organism, actually, other groups of fish, lungfish, actually became better and better adapted to leaving the aquatic environment. So adaptations that favored survival of fish during periodic droughts or life in shallow oxygen-pure waters really pre-adapted them to life on land. So you had these fish that had lungs that allowed them to survive in oxygen-poor water. They also allowed them to survive in these environments that would periodically dry up. So there's a thing called a mud skipper, which I don't know if you ever heard of that, which is basically a fish that will be in these shallow, muddy ponds, and oftentimes those ponds will dry up. And so what it does is when its pond starts drying up, it will scamper across the surface and get into another pond that may be a little deeper. So it's not living out of water for very long, but it has the ability to scamper. Basically what it's doing is its fins, it's able to push itself along the land using its fins, and it has lungs which allow it to get some oxygen for that brief period of time that it's out of the water. So kind of this shows you that the tetrapod body, so tetrapods are having 4 legs, being a land-dwelling animal, didn't evolve out of nowhere. It was actually a modification of these fish that had adapted to being in low oxygen environments, being in environments that would periodically dry up, that they needed a way to get from one place to another. So this is where we start getting vertebrates on land. Okay. So until about 360 million years ago, really vertebrates were all fish. They were all basically fish-like. They might have had some lungfish. There might have been some mud skipper type of animals that could briefly go between aquatic environments. Lobe-fin fishes were the ancestor to tetrapods. They began to evolve limbs in place of their pectoral and pelvic fins. So limbs were basically modified fins that would be able to support body weight and allow them to push off the ground as they skipped between those ponds. So having better and better modifications to their fins to allow them to do that basically led to limbs and led to digits that would allow them to spread out their weight and to push and to grip on the mud as they're moving from one pond to another. So this is where legs and arms first came from. They were just fins that were better adapted for skipping across the surface of the mud. So this is the first kind of way that animals started coming onto land. So here's a picture of an ancient kind of mud skipper called an Acanthostega, which had fully formed legs, ankles, and digits, and lived in Greenland about 365 million years ago. So here it is. It actually has arms and legs, but it's a fish. It's still got a fish tail. It still has lungs or gills. So it still has gills, so it's still able to breathe in the water, but it's also able to move across land. And this is especially well adapted for what are called vernal ponds, so ponds that would dry up parts of the year and it'll be able to skip from one to the other. So pretty cool, I think. Okay, so we know that 365 million years ago, there were body forms that really started to look more like land-dwelling animals. So no later than 350 million years ago, we are going to get the first tetrapods. Tetrapods have 4 limbs with digits instead of fins, and they include groups like amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. They range in size dramatically nowadays from as little as 9.8 millimeters. You can see this little teeny frog next to someone's eye there, all the way up to 30 meters. So there's some giant, so we get some giant, like the giant whales, which actually we'll see evolved back into the water from land later on. Okay. So we're going to talk about these groups, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and we'll also talk about birds, which is another land-dwelling animal that actually came out of the reptile group. So amphibians. There's about 6,150 living species of amphibians. Amphibians are things like lizards, like snakes, and like frogs here that are shown. So, or salamander, there's a salamander here. So amphibians are actually not all that far removed from their fish ancestors. They still have a very aquatic tie in their life. So you can kind of equate this to like the mosses and ferns in plants, that they're land-dwelling, but they have a pretty strong need for water. And so even the word amphibia, which means both ways of life, and we even use that word for like amphibious vehicles that can go between land and water, really brings this forward, that they do require water. The life history of most frog species has an aquatic stage to it and a terrestrial stage to it. So most frogs are born in an aquatic environment. So tadpoles, they have a tadpole stage where they'll actually look like a little fish, and they'll swim around, and then they'll go through a metamorphosis stage where they'll change into a body form that can go onto land, but we'll still find frogs mainly right at the edge of water. This is where they're going to breed. They cannot dry out very, very much, and we're going to see why that is. So many amphibians are actually strictly aquatic or strictly terrestrial. So there are both. There are some amphibians that are always found on land, but they're typically found in moist, humid, kind of more aquatic environments, just because of the way that they're designed. They're made. So that did not go where I was thought it would go. Is that really all I had on there? Okay. Well, I'll talk a little more about that, but I thought it was another slide on amphibians. So amphibians, they have the egg of an amphibian is not very well adapted to land. It requires moisture. And same thing with amphibian skin. Amphibian skin, if it dries out, it's not very useful. Basically, a lot of amphibians will even breathe a little bit. They'll get some oxygen across their skin, and so they need kind of a very thin skin that's still wet in order to be able to get oxygen across their skin, which is one of the main ways a lot of amphibians get oxygen to perform cellular respiration. So in order to really live a full terrestrial life, there needed to be some adaptations, some changes that have allowed for living on land. And one of them, a big one, is the amniotic egg. So amniotes are tetrapods with a terrestrially adapted egg. So reptiles and mammals are amniotes, and the amniotic egg has allowed us and reptiles to live in environments that are further away from water. The egg actually has its own internal source of nutrients and water that it will supply to the growing embryo, and it's sealed off by a shell that protects the egg from drying out. So here's kind of a picture of the inside of an amniotic egg. They have many different membranes inside of that, the amnion, the chorion, the yolk sac, and the allantois. So basically here it's got the yolk of the egg, which is the nutrient part of the egg that supplies nutrients and water to the embryo that's growing there. And it's separated by this chorion, a chorionic sac, from the outside of the egg. And this prevents it from drying out. It's able to keep moisture in the egg and keep it from drying out. If you take a frog egg out of the water and you lay it on the land, it's going to dry out and that embryo is going to die. But you have a chicken egg, it can be on a bed of straw, not in the water, and it's perfectly fine because it has this protective layer, or several protective layers on the outside of the embryo that keeps it from drying out. Okay, so that's mostly the amnion, this amniotic fluid, if you've heard of that in humans. That's what that's doing as well. It's protecting and keeping the embryo moist. And it, really is a key innovation. So why this is an important innovation? It allows amniotes to live further and further away from water. Just like we saw in gymnosperms and angiosperms, they're now able to colonize new environments. Same thing with amniotic organisms like reptiles and mammals. They're now able to move further away from water and still do well. So other innovations that have allowed these mammals and reptiles to live further away from land are shells in reptiles, so shells for the egg protect the egg, or internal development. So mammals have a different way of doing this, and we'll actually see there are mammals that lay eggs, but most mammals have internal development, so we actually protect the egg by keeping it inside of the mother, which reduces egg desiccation. There's also different way of breathing, so rib cage ventilation, so able to be more efficient in bringing oxygen in, and less permeable skin, reducing desiccation. So like I said, the amphibians have very thin skin, which they actually use to get some oxygen across into their body, whereas reptiles and mammals, our skin is basically watertight. It doesn't allow for water loss. This is why we have to have pores that allow for things like sweat to leave our body. We otherwise we don't lose a lot of moisture through our skin itself. All right, so okay, so reptiles are amnions, and reptiles come in many different forms, and actually birds are a branch off the reptile tree. They are, we've talked about this back when we looked at dinosaurs. We showed that birds kind of evolved from dinosaur ancestors, which were reptiles. Reptiles, you'll notice, have much thicker skin. They have these thick, kind of leathery skin that allows them to live further away from the water. So lizards, birds, turtles, snakes, crocodiles, and a bunch of other similar things. Lots of extinct species fit into the reptile group. Reptiles have scales, which protect from abrasion, also protect from desiccation, so their scales are watertight, unlike the amphibian skins. Most of them lay a shelled egg on land, though there are other methods of giving birth. They are what are called ectotherms, and we'll look at this perhaps a little bit if we can get into that in one of our ecology chapters. But what that means is that their main source of body heat is external to them, so they will bask in the sun to warm up their body. They'll go and hide in the shade when it's too warm to cool off. But they're able to survive being in these very dry environments, mainly due to the type of skin that they have. Okay. Okay, so here is kind of a working understanding of the amniote clades, and you can see where mammals are on the bottom there, and reptiles are the top big group. And you can see that the birds are actually just a small branch off of the branches that led to the dinosaurs. So where you see all the dinosaurs, the pterosaurs, ornithischian dinosaurs, saurischian dinosaurs, really dinosaurs, which are sister to crocodiles there, are the closest living relative to birds. So birds basically are what's left of the dinosaurs. So if you want to know what characteristics a dinosaur have, that's all that's left around that has not gone extinct is birds. So they really, reptiles and birds, we can't call them two different clades. We really do refer to birds as different than reptiles because they have a lot of characteristics that are very distinct, but you can see they fall smack in the middle of the reptilian clade. So they're as close to snakes as they are to turtles, like that. So actually, they're closer to snakes than they are to turtles. Okay, but we will talk a little bit about what makes birds unique, because they are slightly different than reptiles, land-dwelling reptiles. So there's about 10,000 species of living birds. They're actually very closely related to crocodiles, but the main feature that links together all birds is that most of the features that birds have are adaptations to flight. So they are a branch that has just become incredibly focused on flying and the ability to have flight. So their wings and feathers are incredibly well adapted to flight. The way their feathers fit together on their wings just create the perfect flight surface that allows them to easily soar through the air. They have an incredible number of weight-saving adaptations. They don't have a bladder. So we store urine and then release it periodically. Birds don't have that. They just pee all the time. Whenever they have to go, it goes. They don't store it up and wait. And so this means they don't have this sac filled with fluid that's weighing them down. Females only have one ovary, so they even save on that. They don't have two ovaries like most other animals, most other chordates. They don't have teeth. They have a beak. Their beak is very well adapted for whatever food source they eat, but they don't waste weight on teeth. They also have very light bones, and I'll show you that in the next slide as to why their bones are lighter than most other animals. They have incredible eyesight. They have incredible fine muscle control. They're real acrobats of the air. All right. So they also their gonads, so their reproductive organs, will change size during the year. They're generally incredibly small and incredibly lightweight, except for when they're reproducing. So they will put extra energy into it and actually change a lot of things when they're going into a reproductive mode. But the rest of the year, they're sort of shut down to save weight so they can fly better. So here's what a bird bone looks like, and this is why you don't want your dog eating chicken bones, but it's perfectly okay for them to chew on the leg bone of a cow, because the leg bone of a cow is solid bone all the way through. Chicken bone, or any other bird bone, is hollow. They have these very kind of lattice-like structures inside their bones, which make their bones very light. So they're holy. They've got lots of holes through them. They also have holes in the middle of their feathers as well. So their feathers are very, very lightweight. And the feathers have these little barbs on them that allow them to link together. So if you've ever seen a bird preening, so picking at their feathers, what they're doing is they're lining up their feathers and kind of weaving them together so that they create one really solid surface. So when they fly, the wind doesn't just go through the feathers, it actually is caught by the feathers because they're all tied together, all held together by these little barb-like hooks on the sides of each feather. So they're incredibly adapted for flight. Okay, so I've already shown you this picture, but this is the earliest known bird is Archaeopteryx, and we discovered this fossils of this bird in Germany. It had feathered wings, but it still had teeth. It had clawed digits and a long tail, so it had a lot of features that reminding us of dinosaurs, but it also had features that remind us of modern birds. It really couldn't take off from a standing position. It had to climb up in a tree and then launch itself off. There are actually some birds that can't take off from a standing position that are alive today. So things like albatross. If you ever look up video of an albatross taking off, it's pretty funny. They have to run, and they're really awkward. They've got huge wings. They just have to kind of run as fast as they can to gain a lot of speed, and then they can start flapping, and eventually they can take off. And it's kind of comedic how awkward they look when they're on land. But a lot of these kind of what are they called pelagic birds, so birds that live in fly out in the ocean, are like that. They're very awkward on land. Okay, so those are birds. Okay, the last group that we're going to focus on and really talk about some of the features are mammals, and this is what you are. So this is probably something you're fairly interested in, is what makes a mammal a mammal. So what are some of the distinctive features of a mammal? Really, there's two features that separate mammals from all other vertebrates, and that is the presence of hair and mammary glands. So the word mammal comes from mammary glands, comes from the milk-producing glands and the fact that we actually feed our young milk early on in development, and that's what all mammals do. So there are about 5,300 known species, in addition to molecular evidence that places them as a separate group from all other vertebrates. They all have hair and mammary glands, so we'll talk a little bit about those. Skin of mammals is pretty thick. It's very protective. It keeps us from drying out for the most part, so we can survive in a variety of different environments. Our skin is very important for temperature regulation. So our blood vessels actually will dilate or constrict depending on the temperature of our skin. Our skin will change shape depending on temperature to either conserve heat or to release heat. And so our blood vessels that are near the surface of our skin will fill with blood when we're really hot, and it'll allow for heat loss across the skin. They'll shut down, and our blood flow will be deeper in our tissue when we're cold, and we'll get things like goosebumps and things like that will change the shape of our skin to prevent or encourage heat loss when necessary. We have hair, and hair on mammals allows us to insulate our body. So some mammals have full coats of hair that will insulate their body. They have long guard hairs and a dense kind of undercoat of hairs that will insulate them. Hairs are also really important for sensory perception, communication, and camouflage. So Arctic foxes, for instance, their hair color will change depending on the season. They'll be white during the winter when there's a lot of snow up north, and it'll be brown in the summer when there's no snow on a lot of places where they live. So that will actually adapt them to be able to survive better and hide from predators, depending on where they are. There are several different major groups of mammals. One of them, which you may or may not know about, but I think is probably one of the wildest groups of mammals, are the monotremes. Monotremes are mammals because they have those characteristics. They have hair, they have mammary glands, they do produce milk, but they diverged about 180 million years ago. There are 5 species that are known, that are living today, and they're only found in Australia and New Guinea. And mammals in Australia and New Guinea, that part of the world, which we'll talk about in a minute, are fairly distinct from other mammals in many ways. So these monotremes, they have hair and they produce milk, but they lack nipples. They actually have these kind of channels on the underside of their body where milk is excreted, and it's not a nipple like all other mammals besides monotremes have. But they do excrete these kind of channels of milk, and their young can suckle on that. One of the kind of crazy things that makes them different from mammals is that other mammals is that they lay eggs. So they do actually lay a very, very small egg, and that egg will hatch, and then they do have parental care, just like other mammals, but they lay eggs. So monotremes, like the echidna and platypus, are pretty distinct from a lot of other mammals. Another group of mammals that's found only or mainly in Australia are marsupials. And they are pretty unique as well. Some characters that they share with other eutherians, so other mammals like us, are that they have nipples, which is unlike the monotremes. They will give live birth, so they don't lay eggs, and they have slightly higher metabolic rates, so we have pretty high metabolic rates, and their embryo is nourished by a placenta at some point. And we won't really go into much detail of that, but placental mammals are what we are. Though unique to marsupials, which is different than other mammals, is that their embryo is born very, very early. So they don't lay an egg, they give live birth, but their gestation period is very, very short. So the female is not pregnant for very long at all. What they do is they give birth, and then the embryo is so underdeveloped that it can't possibly live on its own, so it will complete its development within a special location on the mother called a pouch, or the marsupium. So marsupials are like kangaroos. They have that pouch. The pouch is to protect the embryo while it's very early on in development. And there's trade-offs for animals in terms of whether they lay an egg or they give live birth. So giving live birth means you put a lot of investment into your offspring, and they're pretty likely to do well once they're born. However, you as a parent are risking your life a lot. So you've got to walk around feeding 2 individuals for however long that is. So for humans, that's 9 months. And 9 months of pregnancy is a pretty stressful time. Their complications can arise, and it could be life-threatening to the offspring and the parent. An egg is kind of the other end of the spectrum. They lay this just barely fertilized egg, and the egg develops on its own, where it has a risk of predation and risk of not surviving very well. So an egg-laid animal tends to not fare as well as a live birth animal. Marsupials do something kind of halfway in between. They don't lay an egg, they give live birth, but they give live birth to an organism that left on its own would probably not survive very long. So they then keep them in the pouch. And kangaroos, if their lives are threatened and they're caring for a young in their pouch, they always have the option of abandoning their young and saving their own life so they could maybe have more young. Something that would not be very easy if they were still carrying the young inside the womb. So it's kind of halfway between laying an egg and being able to just walk away versus giving live birth to a more fully formed organism like humans do and being kind of locked into that gestation period. So they're halfway between. They basically continue their pregnancy with the organism on the outside of their body in the pouch. Right? So here's what a newborn marsupial looks like, and you'll notice they really still look like an embryo. Their eyes are not fully developed. There's not all that much resemblance to the adult kangaroo. And so as they age, they'll still be in the pouch, and you might see something like this. This is a young joey that could come out and maybe go back into the pouch, and they might still feed. The nipples are found in that pouch. They can feed while they're in there, and so they'll spend time in and out, and then eventually they'll be outside the pouch. Right? So, all right. So, okay. So placental mammals, which is what humans are, have much longer pregnancies than marsupials. So they give birth to a much more fully formed child. They have placentas that are more complex because they have to feed this embryo for a much longer time. The placenta, which is with a connection between the mother and the embryo, is much more complex. And so the embryos do complete development. And when a human comes out, yes, they're still pretty helpless because they're a human baby, but they have eyes that are open. They are able to breathe on their own. They're able to feed. They are not all that different from an adult human, besides size and ability to take care of themselves. But in many other mammals besides humans, they're pretty much ready to go. They're pretty well formed. So placental mammals or eutherians have that distinction from marsupials. So how did this difference arise? Why are marsupials and eutherians so different? Well, it has to do with the continental drift and what happened in Australia. So basically, most marsupials are today found in Australia, and there's some in North and South America, but mostly they're found in Australia. For about 65 million years, Australia was separated from has been separated from other land masses. So you can see here's where Pangaea was about 250 million years ago. Everything was connected. The Mesozoic area 135 years ago, when Laurasia and Gondwana land separated. Here about 65 million years ago, Australia and Antarctica were attached, but they were separated from everywhere else. So mammals arose while Australia was still attached to, so really early kind of mammalian species would have arisen while Australia was still attached. But modern mammals, modern eutherians, evolved after 65 million years. So Australia has been isolated for 65 million years, kind of on its own, maybe attached to Antarctica for a while, but for a long period just floating on its own. And this has allowed marsupials to kind of figure out their own way of doing things, which was different from mammals in the rest of the world where there was more connection. So North America and South America collided, Africa and Europe collided. There was even a land bridge between Asia and North America, so there was able to be this connection between all those animals, and they stayed pretty similar in their ways of doing things. So what this has led to is convergent evolution. So if we look at the different types of marsupials that exist and the different types of eutherians, we can pick out pairs, things that do very similar things, have very similar ecological roles, but are different, but are mammals versus, or marsupials versus eutherians. So here is a mole versus a marsupial mole. Both of them spend a lot of time underground. They're well adapted for that. You can see their arms are designed for moving through the soil very well. They don't have great eyesight, but they have really good noses for smelling. They're able to navigate underground very well. So there's a marsupial mole, and there's a mole. Here's another example. So here's a flying squirrel versus a flying phalanger. They both look pretty similar when you look at them. They both look like squirrels, but one is a marsupial version of this. They both are able to have skin that allows them to glide from tree to tree, and they fill very similar ecological roles or ecological niches due to convergent evolution. Okay. So that's the end of the mammal chapter.